Hi, everyone, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon for our third session on net zero or not zero. The session is all about the net zero corporate governance landscape. So we've had two amazing sessions already, and we're delighted to have a third. Just going to make sure everyone's admitted from the waiting room. Um, so we're really delighted to be here today with some amazing speakers, and I'm really excited to be lecturing you myself today. So I'm Alexis McGivern, I'm the course director on the Oxford side, and I'll hand over to my colleague Myrna.
Hi, everybody. My name is Myrna. I'm currently based in Cairo, and I'm so excited to facilitate this session today. I helped out with the program last year, and you've probably seen me on Slack a little bit. I have two birds, so if you hear any shrieking, that's them. Sorry about that. And I'm so excited for today's session. Our first speaker, if you could all mute yourselves, that would be fantastic. Our first youth speaker of today is Vikrant, who has an amazing bio, truly. He's a dedicated climate change specialist with extensive experience in multi-stakeholder engagement, civil society, and intergovernmental processes. He focuses on advancing climate adaptation solutions, fostering youth leadership, and shaping policy within the UN system and civil society. Vikrant has played a pivotal role in global environmental governance, contributing significantly to Rio Conventions, UNEP, UNEA, and the INC Plastic Treaty. Currently, he serves as the Asia Pacific focal point for CYMG UNIP, the Younger Focal Point for Asia Youth Empowerment, and is on the Youth Policy Board of the World Food Forum. Additionally, Vikrant sits on the advisory board of multiple UNEP, UNCCD, and UNFCCC accredited organizations and CSOs. Wow, amazing. So Vikrant is going to address India's journey towards net zero, amongst other things. So let's hear from you, Vikrant.
Thank you so much, Myrna, and thank you, Alex. Let me just share my screen and just a second because I can't see the chat. So a thumbs up would be great if
Yeah,
you can see
that's great.
my
Thanks, Vikrant. You
screen.
can see it.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I hope you are enjoying your day, evening, and night. Uh, by the end of presentation, I hope that you will be understanding some of the key points from the Indians' commitment to achieving net zero, including some of the challenges due to the reliance on coal that we have and the rise of the renewable energy. And with that said, we will be also looking through one of the case study where we will be seeing the active role of youth participation in advocating of real challenges in the corporate pledge. Okay. Again, it's been privileged to be speaking with you all. And today, one of the critical topic that we have discussing, particularly, I would be talking about the context of Indian journey and towards net zero emission by 2070. India has made a bold commitment to reach net zero by 2070, and its target reflects that the country dedication is, of course, on global climate action and acknowledge the need of sustainability. But let's be clear, this isn't an easy task. And when I say that it isn't an easy task, it's because India has, you might already know that India has a very heavily demand of coal right now. And it also relies on coal for extreme use, focusing on energy needs, and coal accounts a vast of majority right now at present also, which you can also see on my screen, the data used from the climate tracker action. And at present, there is a significant challenge with us. And at the same time, there is also a rise of the renewable energy, which you can also see on my screen, the primary energy supply. Although the renewable energy right now is really less than 5%, including the hydro and the renewable other source, including the solar itself. Uh, Coal continues again in India context to play a dominant role and in our energy, but at the same time, this growing momentum has been keep on rising from the last 5 year itself, if I say it that, and we can, which you can also see through the some of the statistics which I have showed. Okay. So yeah, which you can also shoot through some of the statistics, which is on one is on the left, the power statistics where it comes from, some of the energy distribution. The black represent on coal, the yellow represent on solar. So that's there. Uh, I would really like to take a moment and share one of the key activist movement that has been going around from the past 10 years, the Hasdev Aryan movement. It's a youth-led movement uh, by the grassroots people itself, and it's been began in 2020, 2011, 2011 to protect the Hasdev, which is the forest in Chhattisgarh, India. Chhattisgarh is also one of the prime spot for the coal mining itself. The project covered around 1,700 square kilometer. The forest was also the home to a rich biodiversity and indigenous tribal community. When I say was, because most of the 10 years of during the time, most of the forest was cut down. But in this case, there is a significant role of how powerful youth and indigenous community can lead an action, and it has emerged in one of the country's most ecological and sensitive area from the destructive that can happen in the coal mining. The movement mobilized thousands of indigenous people, environmental activities, and continued for almost 10 years. And some of the key highlight of this 10-year program was again, it started in 2020, 11, and it almost ended in 2021 with a law which provide no constructions of the new coal mining project in that specific area, protected land, and with the legal protections of the protector itself. One of the prominent leader, which you can see also on my screen, called Alok Shukla, which recently received the Goldman Environmental Prize for his work on the Hasdev project. And one of the thing that it's also a powerful example of how youth activism can play a role in it, that and few of the whether this movement was success, that it was led by the youth and the indigenous leadership itself from the place where this mining was started, and it quickly catches the spark from all over India, where hundred of you joined together and went to that split and started collaborating at the same time, where different collaborators came together, including the NGO, grassroots efforts, legal batters, people, those who do that, and also some of the international community came together to support us. Definitely, there was another point on success was there was a legal and political pressure at the same time, but global recognition at the end also plays very important role to make it happen, and Goldman Environmental Prize was one of its achievement for it, and this movement ended in 2021. So with that said, I know I don't have a lot of minute, but with that said, three of the important goals that uh, we need to discuss, and we need to also keep on asking to our corporate leader whenever these sort of projects come. That one is transparency. It's not in the context of India, but also in context of global corporates. That it must be clear and actionable goals, providing transparent report, and it provide building on trust and also credibility to ensure that projects is measurable, and at the same time accountability. Committing alone is not so progressive, but at the same time how community can come together, and how other major stakeholder can also be put into accountable at the same time, and also at the same time keeping ensure that the companies and the government stay accountable to their net zero place. And at the last, collaboration with that case study, achieving net zero require definitely across different stakeholders from government, corporate, civil society, especially youth has to play a key role. And from the context of India, where 60% of the population right now are below 30. So, with that said, youth play a very pivotal role in advocating this ambition climate change. And we hope that leaders that hold accountability and will come together to drive innovation in this climate change solution. And I will stop here and will maybe request to further share this presentation to those who want to read the recommendation and further reading on these case studies. And yeah, some of the report that I have shared on my presentation can also be uh, read for further reading and understanding and taking some of the recommendation from here. Over to Myrna. And I
Whoa.
hope I was at the limit of the time.
I was about to say that was amazing. It's so great to hear. And thank you for being so perfectly on time. Thank you so much. And we'll be sure to share your presentation with the cohort. Someone has their hand raised. Do we have a minute for a question or do we do it later?
I have a small question for Vikrant.
You can ask it. Just be quick with it.
Yes, I'm from Sri Lanka and I'm currently working on this climate change and interfaith. And also I'm curious how tradition knowledge is very important for the solution of climate change. And what do you think how India is actually working on that process?
I can't speak on behalf of government, but someone as a youth who is an observer to this traditional knowledge, I work in indigenous community in the Western Ghat. Western Ghat is also one of the hot biodiversity area which flows from the Indo-Malay region. So you can maybe, I definitely know that there might be people from the Asia Pacific region. So Indo-Malay is also one of the hot biodiversity area. So there has been a triggering point whenever the discussion of just transactions happen, where indigenous has not been looked up as one of the key strong stakeholder, where they can play a very important role. Not just they have the knowledge of the land, they have the knowledge of the indigenous variety, but also when we talk about the just transaction, these stakeholders play a lot of important roles. In Indian context, from my personal view, I can say that there is still a very big gap which need to be filled, especially when we are quoting that India would be one of the developed country in next 10 to 15 years. So that's being said, and hope that it take into an accountability to having some of the major stakeholder, at least when we are talking this discussion moving forward under the just transactions.
That's a wonderful answer. Thank you so much, Vikrant, and thank you for your presentation and your work. So just a few key logistics message before we move to our second speaker. I noticed some people in the chat were having some trouble with audio. So just make sure that on the bottom part of the screen, you click the globe that says interpretation. And if you're listening in English, you would be choosing original audio interpretation off. So if you have any troubles, it might be that you're on the wrong language channel. And if you still have some problems, then you can also watch the recording afterwards. Also, we'll have breakout rooms for the last 20 minutes of the session today. So if you can put right next to your name the language that you would like to select for the breakout room. So for example, having French or English or Spanish first. And so then you'll be able to self-select, but to be able to put you in the right room. So Jamie, if we can share the screen, that would be great, please. Thank you so much. And then just as a final note, we have the quiz that will be going out on Friday, and that will cover the first 2 weeks of material. So just, I think we went fast over this. I missed this at the beginning. Apologies of the learning outcomes for the session. So this session with Vikrant's presentation and with mine and Camilla's, our key learning outcomes are the following. So by the end of the session, you should be able to say what makes a good net zero pledge, to navigate a conversation about the net zero governance landscape, to deliver some key messages on convergence in that landscape. Camilla will be walking us through how to grade the quality of a net zero pledge. And finally, understanding where AI fits in the responsible use of AI for monitoring net zero. So we can go to the next slide, please. So much. Great. So now we're very lucky to have a presentation from Camilla Hislop. She is the data co-lead for the Net Zero Tracker, and she coordinates their dozens and dozens of volunteers that keep the tracker's database running, which she will explain more about in just a minute. She is also at the same time pursuing a PhD on how carbon offsets fit into the Net Zero project. She brings a wide-ranging background in law, an evolving knowledge of ecology, and a particular interest in how carbon offset projects and net zero more generally affect people and ecosystems in the global south. Camilla holds a BA and an LLB from the University of Cape Town in South Africa and an LLM from UC Berkeley, as well as an MSc in Environmental Change and Management from Oxford University. And Camilla is also a close personal friend, so I'm really delighted to have her today. So over to you, Camilla. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Alexis. So I'm going to share my screen. In addition to climate change, I always think that sharing your screen is probably the greatest challenge that we have as a humanity. And in fact, aha, I found the button. There we go. Excellent there. Cool. So as Alexis mentioned, I am the data lead at the Net Zero Tracker, and I'm going to talk to you today a bit about what we do at the tracker and how you can grade whether a net zero target is a good or bad one. I hope that you can learn something from it, because we've really seen this rise of net zero targets over the last couple of years. This is from at the tracker, we do these stocktake reports, which look at what the net zero landscape looks like every year. And this is from last year's. Our next stocktake report actually comes out in about 2 weeks. But you can see that we've really seen across the world and across different types of entities the increasing rise of net zero. And part of this, I think, is because we have seen nations really taking this a little bit more seriously. If you look at the top bit of this graph, you can see our data from December 2020, and you can see that for nations, the pink bar is the biggest, which is that a net zero target is proposed or in discussion, whereas by June 2023, you can see that the dark green and light green bars are 75% of the net zero targets for countries, and those are in law and in policy. So we went from, this is about 7% in law and policy in 2020 to about 75% in 2023, which is astounding, right? We've really seen that net zero targets are now being embedded into law and being taken seriously. And this means that not only are 88% of global emissions covered by a net zero target, but also that loads of different types of entities are setting net zero targets. So this is our latest data from the Net Zero Tracker. I took it from the tracker this morning. So you can see 150 countries, 186 regions, 274 cities, and 1,178 companies. Now, the companies is pretty striking because that's more than half of the biggest publicly listed companies in the world, which is really important because we're trying to get as many people on board as possible. But the reason that we kind of care about this is that we want everyone to be setting a net zero target, but we also want them to be getting there. And so that's why the tracker exists. We kind of think about the tracker in 5 ways. And the first is the most important one I'm kind of here to talk to you about is this credibility thing. It's really interrogating how good are the targets, because it's all very well having a target, but we need to be ensuring that we have robust targets. And by doing this, by making our data publicly available, we're trying to show all entities that we're keeping an eye on them. And I think Vikrant really mentioned this at the end of his presentation, kind of this idea of transparency and accountability. It's really important, and that's what we're trying to do. So by holding them accountable, we create fear and peer pressure. We see very often that companies will look at our data to see how other companies are doing. And I often get emails. I had a very healthy exchange with Netflix over a long time by making sure that we were getting their net zero target correct. So the point is that we're trying to create pressure, and we're also trying to help people to show that there is convergence on what's a good net zero target. And I think Alexis will talk you through this very ably in a bit. And then kind of less important is this, that we're providing context and that we show you all the good work that other people are doing. But more important is that we're really interested in collaboration, because it's really important that we're all moving towards net zero. And so I mentioned our stock take report, and this is just a kind of highlights reel of who covered it. So we had some feedback from people in the UNFCCC and kind of a load of journalists, and then Greta retweeted us. The point is that there's no point in us creating data if it's not being used. And the reason that we create this data is that people all over the world can use it to hold entities accountable. So I would like you to be able to look at a net zero target. That could be for Apple, or it could be like I did for my favorite peanut butter, which is Pip and Nut, and which it says it's carbon neutral on it, so that you can use it to hold them accountable. So how do we do that? So at the Net Zero Tracker, we do this under 4 main buckets. We think that there are 4 buckets to assess the robustness of a target. And that's targets, coverage, governance, and then carbon credits and sinks. We've additionally looked at whether or not they have a fossil fuel phase out, because we really need to urgently phase out fossil fuels. And we can discuss that a bit if we have time. But for now, let's talk through the 4 kind of key ones that we have looked at for the last 3 years. So first, the question you're going to ask is, does this entity, whether it's a country, a city, a region, a company, your university, your local school, whatever, do they have a target? The way that I usually do this is by looking at their website, because they usually have, if they're a big company, they might have a sustainability part of their website, or you could actually just Google like South Africa Net Zero. Oh, I forgot to mention that I'm in Johannesburg right now, and a special shout out to all of my African brothers and sisters on this call. But hello to everyone else. It's very nice to be back on the continent. So if you Google South Africa Net Zero, you would see that South Africa has a net zero target for 2050. Then the next question you're going to ask is, where is that target? You know, where is South Africa's net zero target? And that can be anywhere from, it was mentioned offhand, maybe at a conference by the president, all the way through to it's been achieved and it's been validated by a third party. So the more it's embedded within that entity's kind of decision-making architecture, the better it is, right? So you ideally would be looking at maybe a report, like an annual report for a company, or a climate action report maybe done by a city. So you're trying to find as official document as possible to see if they've really put their net zero target into it. So you could look for a law as well. Something like South Africa actually has just passed a climate law, but didn't include the net zero target in that law, which I think is very interesting. So it's not as strong as if it were a law. Once you've worked out what the status of that target is, then the next question you're going to ask is, do they have an interim target? Because it's all very well having this net zero target that's kind of floating off in mid-century. We need to be making sure that we're doing the work now, because the earlier we start, the better it is. And so we look to see if they have interim targets. A lot of interim targets are for 2030, but they could be for a range of dates. I've seen 2028, I've seen 2039. And usually it's in the same place. They'll have their kind of end target. And then we ask, what type of target is that interim target? Is it an emissions reduction target? Do they have a renewable energy target? And then once you've asked that, you've kind of ticked off that whole bucket. So now you've got a sense of what their targets are. Now that you know that, the next question is, well, what does that actually cover? How much of the greenhouse gas emissions of this entity does that actually cover? So the first question you're going to ask is, which gases does it cover? Is it all greenhouse gases? Is it just carbon dioxide? Is it maybe just methane, which is very unlikely? Or do they actually have no idea? Often they don't really have an idea, but we're increasingly seeing entities kind of coming to grips with which greenhouse gases that they are covering. Then if you're looking at a government, you're going to be asking about consumption and then aviation and shipping questions, because often a city or a region or a country will have emissions associated with products maybe that come in from outside of their geographic borders. So you can imagine that South Africa, for example, has imported something from, let's say, China, and we're thinking about those emissions associated with transporting that, but then also with producing that. But that's what we look at for governments. And then for companies, we look at the scopes. So the scopes basically are this way that we divide up the different emissions associated with company. So scopes 1 and 2 are kind of the emissions that are more under the control of a company, where scopes 3 is the emissions associated with who they buy from and who they sell to. And that's the kind of usually can be the big part of their emissions. So if you think about an oil and gas company, the emissions are largely associated with me driving my car rather than with they're drilling it in the sea, for example. So we look at whether or not those scopes are covered. And usually companies are quite good about saying whether or not they are covered. So once you've done that, then you're going to ask a question that is really rare, which is, are the historic emissions covered? It's basically that I can think of off the top of my head, Microsoft, which has, it's just thinking about its emissions from the 1970s. Most other people are like, net zero. So they don't really have a great idea of how they're going to get to net zero, let alone thinking about their previous emissions. So that's probably going to be a no, but we should ask it anyway, because we should be thinking about historic emissions. Once you've thought about coverage, you're going to move on to governance, which is, as it says on the tin, how are they governing their plan? So the first question is, do they have a plan to get to net zero? And this really is thinking about where their emissions come from and how they plan to reduce them. And this can be anything from a kind of, they've set it out a bit in their report, to that they have a full-scale climate plan. Then the reporting mechanism is, are they reporting back on the progress that they're making? So, for example, I looked at Apple's report recently, and in their 2024 report, they report back on the progress that they made in 2023 towards the 8 goals or 10 goals that they have. So that's a really good example of that. Formal accountability is really important because we need people to feel like they have a stake in getting to this target. And the question that we ask here is, does the president or the mayor or the CEO, will they be on the hook if they don't make progress towards their target? This could be that in the context of a company, for example, their bonus or their salary will be affected by whether or not they meet that target. So that's the one I always look for. But there are other ways. It could be in a law, or it could be in policy that leadership kind of has to report back on how they're doing, for example. Now, my favorite indicator, the most important, I think, is equity. So at the tracker, we think about this in 2 ways. And if you have any feedback, do get in touch, because it's really important to get this right. It's really nuanced. So we're thinking about it on the one hand about fair share. So as we know, different entities have contributed to historic cumulative emissions in different ways. So if we think about the UK, where I live half the year, and South Africa, where I live the other half of the year, the UK has, both of these countries have contributed a lot to historic emissions. The UK because they just really got started before everyone else. And South Africa because we have a energy system that has largely been dominated by coal. And so if we think about that they've really produced more greenhouse gases than most other countries, then we have this idea that they should be more ambitious. But the UK and South Africa have very different contexts, right? And due to colonial structures and that continue actually until this day, South Africa has a lot of work to do until I feel that every person in the country can live a dignified life. And in that way, we can kind of say, well, it's more fair for the UK to be doing the harder work now, so that South Africa has a little bit more breathing room. And we see that kind of Sweden has an earlier target, India and China have slightly later targets. So there are differences in the way that we're thinking about it. So that's one way to think about equity. The other way is to think about the just transition and making sure that we bring everyone along. This could be through reskilling people. It could also be through making sure that disadvantaged groups have access to funding or are being prioritized for the way that we do our climate action. So and this is usually actually pretty well set out compared to the fair share. So that's what we ask under governance. I'm quickly going to talk you through carbon credits and sinks, and then we can talk about AI. So carbon credits and sinks, we all know that net zero is taking the same amount of greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere that we emit into it. And we're talking about this kind of taking out piece here. The first, we think about it two ways. The first is offset credits. So I'm sure we all know what offsets are. This is pretty widespread. So for example, as I've mentioned, Apple, they have a target for 2030, I think, of climate or carbon neutral, but they're only intending to go to they're only going to deal with 75% of their emissions, and the remaining 25 they intend to offset. And then we ask, if they are intending, like Apple, to use offset credits, then what are those conditions? Are there any conditions? Are they intending to offset only a certain amount? Then carbon removals more broadly are really important for us getting to net zero. It's in all of our models. And so we ask whether or not they're intending to do carbon removals. This could be planting trees, or it could be those huge machines that Microsoft uses to pull stuff out of the air. And then we ask whether or not they have a separate target for reductions and removals. So that's, in a nutshell, how you would decide whether or not a net zero target is robust. And I think, just as an example, this is from a stock take, a really good example of this is offset credits, because it's kind of, you can see that there isn't really convergence in how entities are using offset credits. So some are using offsets with conditions, some are, but with no conditions, some are not specified, and some have ruled out their use. And it's really important that we're collecting this data, because using offsets can have really big implications. So as Alexis mentioned, I do some work on this. Offsets can mean that people are forced off their land. It can mean that we mess up our ecosystems because we plant trees in the wrong places, for example. But they could also be a really good way of bringing finance to communities that need it. So companies, for example, need to be really specific about what they're intending to do for offsets. So that is to say, please check always when you're looking at a net zero target if they're intending to use offsets. Then in my last 3 minutes, I'm quickly going to tell you about AI. We have the tracker runs, very luckily, and great privilege of my life, actually, that I have been able to coordinate all the volunteers. There are volunteers all around the world who work on the tracker, who basically do the process that I just took you through. And if you want to join, we'd love to have you. It's a really great way to look at net zero targets. Just look on the website. But we're trying to help our volunteers so that they don't have to do the long process of searching and Googling by using AI. And so one of the ways that we do this is we web scrape. So you can see what our AI does, and this was developed by Albert Rittaker, and then us at Oxford Net Zero and the Data Driven Enviro Lab, is we made a kind of target entity list, which is our entity list from the tracker. We created a dictionary of the things that we're looking for, and then basically the computer does this huge Google search using our dictionary of search terms. Then it kind of filters it for us, pulls the stuff out. We look at that, tell it whether it's good or not, and then feed it back in. And then it keeps repeating like that, so that we can pull out the kind of best data on net zero targets and the kind of latest data, because there's quite a lot of data out there, as you can imagine, and then being able to kind of pull from across the web is really helpful. And then the other way that we're using AI is like some other groups, and I actually mentioned them here because I think that there are some really amazing stuff happening out there. So a shout out in particular to Climate Policy Radar, who I think are amazing. They do the climate change laws of the world with the Grantham Institute. It's really, really amazing. If you ever need a search for something in climate laws, you can literally just search and the AI kind of goes through it. Then Chat Climate is not necessarily net zero, it's more climate science, IPCC, but it's our friends from the University of Zurich, and also based half in Oxford. And you can ask questions about the IPCC to understand more about kind of the science. And then we made it our own, I should say. It's a bit like ChatGPT, which pulls live from our report and our data at the tracker. And you can ask questions about net zero. So for instance, there, does Walmart's net zero target cover all of its emissions? And I think this is really useful because it helps us kind of pull together information from all over and then kind of simplify it so that we can understand it better, and then kind of don't have to do all that work so that we can move on to do better things. It's been a great pleasure talking to you today. And I look forward to chatting more in the questions, and thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Camilla. It's always so great to hear you talk about the Net Zero Tracker. If we can just put up the share screen, please, Jamie. It's really cool. Camilla and I sit right next to each other in the office, and I get to see day in and day out how hard she works on the Net Zero Tracker. So it's really cool to see you talk about it here. So thank you so much. I'll just share the screen actually. Sorry. Just a reminder that we have some time for the Q&A afterwards, and I see that there are already some questions in the chat, which is really great, and love to see those, and please keep them coming. Just gonna share my screen with this now. Cool, sorry. Yikes, there we go. Do you see that?
I don't know if you guys guessed, but Alexis is our next speaker, and we're so excited to hear from her. I know you all know her from this year's program and last year if you watched it all on YouTube, but I'll introduce her to you one more time. So Alexis McGivern is the Net Zero Integrity Manager at Oxford Net Zero, an interdisciplinary research group based at the University of Oxford. She works to translate academic research on net zero into guidance for corporations, civil society, policymakers, and the standard community on credible climate action to reach net zero by 2050. Fingers crossed. Alexis co-created and runs the Global Youth Climate Training Program. As you all know, it's a collaboration between Oxford and the Global Youth Coalition to train young climate change makers. She co-chairs the Race to Zero Professional Service Providers, PSP, working group, convening a diverse group of stakeholders to better define what high-integrity net zero looks like for PSPs, like law firms and consultations. Prior to working on issues of climate change, Alexis worked for several years at the International Union for Conservation of Nature on issues of conserving marine biodiversity. So Alexis is going to talk us through many things, and especially the net zero governance landscape. We're so excited to hear from you.
Thanks so much, Myrna. And it's really, really cool to be able to lecture you guys myself. So yeah, I've called my presentation The Why and How of Reaching Net Zero. So it dovetails on what Vikrant and Camilla have already said and really focuses on the governance. So Camilla's presentation focused on really assessing the quality of a net zero pledge and having that fear and peer pressure. And mine focuses on the mechanisms of voluntary initiatives or standards or membership organizations that make sure that if you make a pledge to get to net zero, to contribute to global net zero, that you're actually following through on that. So what will we cover today? We'll cover the ambition action gap, how to engage actors on high integrity net zero, what makes a good net zero target, which you've just heard really well from Camilla, and how do we make sure organizations follow that best practice? So something that I always like to start my presentations with is this quote from Catherine Wilkinson, who put together a really lovely anthology of writings from women working on climate change. It's a magnificent time to be alive at a moment that matters so much. We're really grateful to you all for being here with us on the training. And I know that climate change, for many of us, probably for most of us who are spending their free time doing extra training, can feel really overwhelming and scary and hard to plan for the future. And we really understand that, and climate grief is very real. But it's also a time where all of our actions really matter a lot, more so than kind of maybe any other time in human history. And that's also a time for collaboration and community and change. So just want to ground us in some really great words to start. So I sit, and myself and Camilla both sit in a research group called Oxford Net Zero, and it is an interdisciplinary research group based here at the University of Oxford. We're about 40 researchers across 10 different departments of the university, and what's really unique about it is that it's researchers from all different disciplines coming together. So we have anthropologists working with physicists, working with biologists, earth scientists, geographers, lawyers, and it just gives us a really interdisciplinary understanding of what it really means to reach net zero by 2050. And the idea is that we take all of that interdisciplinary knowledge and that we're able to make it practical and understandable and operationalizable for practitioners. So particularly for standard setters, for policymakers, for civil society, and for businesses. And some of our work that you might have heard of, for example, the Oxford offsetting principles, which were revised earlier this year, that give best practice guidance on how and where and under what circumstances you should be using carbon credits. That's probably our most well-known piece of work. And the Net Zero Tracker, of course, which Camilla has just walked you through. So what do we know about climate change? Well, there's a lot that we know, especially in this cohort. But I just want to bring us through the warming stripes. So this is the warming stripes from Professor Ed Hawkins at the University of Reading, just down the road from us in Oxford, about 30 minutes away. And each stripe represents, sometimes on a longer scale, they're each individual years, or they could be segments of 2 to 5 years, but it just shows the average temperature in that year. So if you haven't seen this image already, I've seen this. I have a colleague who has a jacket made out of the warming stripes that he wears to conferences and things like that, just as a visual reminder of how bad our climate, how quickly our climate is warming and how severe it is. And what do we know about climate change? We know that it is happening. We know that it is happening because of human activity. And we know that those who are least responsible and the most vulnerable will bear the most impact. But also critically, we know that we're at an intervention point that we can decide what we will do and how we will act that will allow us and other creatures to face a more livable future. So I really like this graph from Our World in Data. I, maybe more than some, can be a real cynic about the impact of climate policy or climate governance. I think when you've been in the field for a little bit of time, which I've been in this field for about 10 years, I think some of my peers who have been working on climate change for 40 or 50 years, I don't know how resilient they can be. It's amazing. But I think it's something that can really reinforce pessimism. And I guess one thing that I like about this graph is that we see at the top, and I don't know if you can see my cursor, this is the temperature warming that we would have expected without any kind of climate policies, without any kind of collaboration. And this is where we are now. This is 2.5 to 2.9 degrees of expected warming based on the current climate policies. And I just want to remind ourselves, yes, we're very far off where we need to be for this bottom line of a 1.5 degree pathway, but we're also far off where we would have been without any kind of collaboration. And that's important to remember, that the more we can continue to bend that curve downwards and do that through collaboration, the closer we are able to have a livable future for all of us. And so why do we care about net zero by 2050? So Camilla mentioned this, and we also had John Lang cover this in his remarks last week. But net zero by 2050 is really about balancing sources and sinks of emissions in the atmosphere. And there's a little bit of confusion sometimes over what net zero by 2050 means. So this graph, we often use it in presentations to explain the sort of differences between states. So we have business as usual, where we have emissions coming downwards, but we have a massive amount of emissions still kind of under the curve. Sorry, I think someone's just writing on the board. If we could erase that, that would be great, please. Thank you. And then we have carbon neutral, this is something that Camilla was just mentioning in her presentation. A lot of times businesses will have still a lot of area under this curve, but they're purchasing offsets to make sure that they get to a neutral level. And that is not the same thing, because you're not actually displacing carbon, you're just displacing the accounting or ownership of carbon. Then we have net zero, which is where we have near zero fossil fuel use, and we have a balance between the sources and sinks of emissions. And then climate positive or net positive, or sometimes, there's different terms for it, but it essentially means that you're removing actually more from the ecosystem than you have put in. So those are the kind of differentiation between terms that we use. And so why do we care about the non-state actors? So that's cities, states, regions, investors, financial institutions, businesses. Those are all of the actors that can contribute to climate action, but that are not state governments. And why do they matter? Well, we have just covered the stat from Camilla, but I just ask in the chat, what percentage of global GDP is covered by some form of a net zero target? Now, I'll wait for a second in the chat and see what people say. What percentage of global GDP is covered by some form of a net zero target? Okay, 92, 85, 70. Okay, I'll take two more answers maybe. 65, 65%. Great. So it's actually quite high. It's 88% of our emissions are covered by some form of net zero target, and 92% of GDP, and 89% of the population is living under some sort of net zero target. So that's the answer there is 92%. So we have really high coverage of net zero pledges. And that, as someone just said in the chat, that's heartening. It means that as compared to a few years ago, we have a lot of dedication towards committing towards net zero. And this is some data from the net zero tracker that Camilla just briefly walked through. We have 148 countries, we have 176 regions, big chunk of companies as well. And this is really great. We see lots of pledges to commit to global net zero. However, and this is just a graph actually from an upcoming paper that the net zero tracker is publishing, and it just shows kind of moments in history and how that has translated to this increase of pledges, and both what has been proposed, what is in policy, in law, and what has been achieved. And that is in blue, which you can see very little of. And same with companies. We see Fridays for Future, very few net zero pledges until then. Fridays for Future, it starts to creep up. The 1.5 degree special report, it starts to creep up. COP25, even more. And, you can see this proliferation upwards. So we see this massive increase in net zero pledges. But we also see what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called a surplus of confusion and a deficit of credibility when it came to actually making a net zero pledge. Because a few years ago, a company like Microsoft could make a net zero pledge and say, we are committed to net zero by 2050. And then that was sort of it. There was not that much of an ecosystem to be able to say, okay, is that a good pledge? Are you making targets in the interim? So what happens, you have a pledge for net zero by 2050. What happens in 2030 or 2035 or 2040? What coverage of emissions do you have? And what scopes are you including? There wasn't really a scrutiny ecosystem. And this has led to kind of headlines like this, COP26 is just greenwashing, says activists like Greta Thunberg. Big polluters are using net zero to block meaningful action at COP26. Corporate greenwashing misuses net zero pledges. More companies make net zero pledges. Some are not as good as they sound. And so that's really where our research group, and specifically our team, focuses in on, is the governance of when you make a pledge, making sure that it actually happens. And so we actually split our strategy between the actors that we think are most important to high integrity net zero. So when it comes to the private sector, we give them guidance on what best practice for net zero looks like. So I'll walk through that in just a second. Then we try to feed that best practice into the standards community. So that is places like the International Standards Organization that can give an auditable mechanism against which companies can be assessed for their performance on net zero. We also feed into civil society groups where there are gaps in the way that they are approaching trying to close the loopholes on net zero. We can say, actually, this is a really emerging area that not enough people are paying attention to. Then also to the policy community, We make recommendations on regulation and on policy to be introduced to both match the existing standards and go further to be able to be more ambitious. And finally, we also make sure that our information, our data, our reports are publicly available so that people who fall outside of those groups can still educate themselves. So net zero, there are lots of climate justice specific concerns around net zero governance. Camilla walked through some on carbon markets and offsets, the land use of using land for absorbing carbon rather than for food production, for example, which has been termed carbon colonialism. There's also this idea of the depoliticization of net zero. So I mentioned at the beginning, net zero is a balance of sources and sinks in the atmosphere. But of course, climate change is much more than just equalizing emissions. Every emission has an impact. For example, if you are extracting and burning fossil fuels, you have to impact biodiversity or human health or land rights in order to be able to access those fossil fuels. And burning them can also cause a range of human health issues as well. So it's not just 1 ton in and 1 ton out. Each ton is politicized and has political implications for people's quality of life. Then there's also, as Tim Kruger mentioned last week, about the moral hazard of this idea of carbon removal. If we have this framing of net zero, we just need to balance sources and sinks, then theoretically you could emit for a long, long time and then just remove it all with carbon removal near the end of near 2050, near the date of net zero that you're trying to achieve. And Tim spoke about this last week, that there's a fear of the moral hazard of emitting and then actually not being able to do that carbon removal, and there's a reliance there built in. So another question here around historical distrust of the corporate actors. We're relying on businesses to both set ambitious targets and also deliver on them. And they are not always, shall we say, the most trustworthy when it comes to implementing high integrity solutions, especially when it comes to big actors like the fossil fuel industry. And also, Camilla also addressed this, the mandate to phase out fossil fuels is not really included in the framing of net zero as it stands. And then restoration of biodiversity is also a key area, as well as making sure that we're distributing climate solutions like patents that are held for climate tech. These are mostly held in the global north right now. So what makes a good net zero target? I'll go over this fairly quickly because we've just covered this with Camilla, but we use a simple acronym to sort of score a net zero strategy. And this helps us, when you're totally offhand and you're remembering the table that Camilla showed you earlier, you can also use the acronym SCORE. So I mentioned first, if you have a commitment for net zero by 2050, what is your short-term plan and short-term target? You're not just having one really long target into the future. The second is, are you covering all greenhouse gases and covering all scopes? It's a real red flag for me, for example, when the fossil fuel industry has a strong net zero target that only covers scopes 1 and 2, which is more of the operational emissions, and doesn't cover, for example, the combustion of those fossil fuels away. So if you're driving a car that has been that has gas in it from Shell is not actually necessarily including those emissions in their planning, which is the bulk of their emissions, about 80% of their emissions. We want to see offsetting used scarcely, and if it is used with very strict conditions. Want to see strong reporting and accountability. So the typical reporting interval is 1 year that you would be reporting annually on your progress, and you have to publish that so that people can access it. And then equity for workers, communities, and global impact. So making sure, as Camilla was mentioning earlier, that your net zero target considers a global contribution to net zero and not just trying to equalize your emissions. So how do we make sure, now that we know what a good net zero target looks like, how do we make sure that organizations actually follow that best practice? Well, there is a very large and very complex governance ecosystem to make sure that we get to net zero. So we did an assessment with my colleague Matilda and Kaya, who will be lecturing to you guys all on Thursday, on how much does that governance landscape that gives best practice guidance kind of follow good net zero criteria across the different stages of setting and implementing a net zero target. So we looked at 37 different voluntary governance initiatives, disclosure frameworks, reporting guidance, and these are documents and guidance that businesses use when they're trying to plan for their net zero strategy. And we looked at it over what we called the 7 stages of setting a net zero target. So preparing for a net zero target, quantifying your emissions, setting a target, planning your reductions, counterbalancing, so i.e. offsets, thinking about impact and equity, and reporting. And we looked at these 37 different initiatives, and we broke them up into guidance initiatives, disclosure, and assessment frameworks. And we basically painstakingly, with some research assistants who are absolutely fantastic, we went through every single line of those and basically mapped them to say, what are they saying and do they agree with each other or not? Because what we heard from businesses about 2 years ago was, well, I want to set a net zero target and I want to set a good net zero target, but every single time I try to set one, all of these governance initiatives are telling me to do something different, and I can't possibly be guided because they're all saying different things. And when we did this report in 2022, we found that actually there are lots of governance initiatives because people like to make new things, but they're all broadly saying the same thing, that the practice for getting to net zero is, and high integrity net zero is broadly the same across all of them. And what we look at then is how that moves from the criteria that are at the strong voluntary initiatives. We update and refine them. We kick out any weak ones, any weak criteria that are not working, and then we go into what we call orchestration campaigns. So that's when something like the Race to Zero, big groups of, for example, I work with a group called Purpose Disruptors who are specifically speaking about the advertising industry, and they say, we all follow this code of conduct, and if you follow this code of conduct on best practice net zero, you can be in the club, and if you can't, then you're out. So best practice from orchestration campaigns then gets consolidated into standards, which can be audited against, and then that gets even more formalized into regulations. This is the governance conveyor belts that my colleague at Oxford, Tom Hale, developed, and we really use it to think about how we're intervening at different levels. And then that last bit on regulation, we look at regulation as well. We track regulation specifically across the G20 to see how much have those best practice criteria from the voluntary initiatives made it through to the regulatory landscape. And we look at financial product standards, at disclosure, at procurement standards, and transition plan requirements. And this is just some of our spreadsheet tracking that my colleague Lucilla Diaz did. And what we see is a massive growth in the number of regulations. So we see a much stronger governance landscape now than before. But what we need to ensure is that the governance landscape continues to have increased scrutiny on people making pledges to make sure that when you make a pledge, you're actually following through with it. So where do we go from here, and what do we want to, achieve in the next kind of 2 to 3 years, I would say. So we want to make sure that net zero pledges have strong integrity, that we make sure we close and handle all of the loopholes that still exist in the net zero governance landscape. For example, residual emissions thresholds. So right now, companies or an organization setting a net zero target doesn't need to reduce their emissions by 100%. They are allowed to, the best practice guidance right now is about 90%, and then the remaining 10% could be removed by offsets or dealt with by offsets. And the question is, some sectors have a much lower residual emission threshold, so they're actually allowed to continue emitting up to 70% of their they only have to reduce 70% of their emissions, and they have 30%, which is large, especially when you come to big industries. And then the area of work that I'm working on right now, that Marina mentioned in my introduction, is where do professional services providers fit into this? So when a lawyer advises, gives advice to a client to advise on how they should move forward, for example, on going ahead with fossil fuel extraction, how much is the lawyer responsible for that, and how much is the consultant or other professional services responsible for that, and do they take any accountability for the advice that they give if that advice directly leads a client to a higher emissions outcome? Then we want to improve scrutiny and oversight on net zero pledges. So making sure that what Camilla is doing, making sure that there is a strong watchdog system, and of course, encouraging greater regulation. That's our focus, our main priority focus. And so these are just also, well, the slides have been uploaded into our shared participants folder, which I'll put the link into right now. But these are some resources, some websites, podcasts, and books that are very useful to do some further reading about climate change. And just as a last piece of information, myself and a colleague at Oxford set up a platform called 26,000 Climate Conversations, which we set up before COP26. And the idea is that we take a lot of information about how to have productive climate conversations, and we encourage people to have conversations, and then they can submit conversation, like notes from their conversation afterwards. And then there's a big global map where you can see, for example, this one from Los Angeles, California, of someone speaking about how bad wildfires are becoming. So the idea is having conversations about climate change outside of your echo chamber and really engaging people that you know in your regular life. And so we're trying to track those. It's just a fun little project. So we'd love to see your climate conversations that you're having about net zero governance afterwards. And that's it for me. If you have any questions, that's my email. And you can also reach out to me at the Youth Climate Training email. And I'll hand back over to Myrna for a Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alexis. And everyone does have questions. There are so many questions. So I don't think we'll have the time for all of them, but we'll go through however many we can. We'll start with something kind of that hopefully should be simple, and it's for both you and Camilla. How can countries best prepare to be trackable, especially developing countries who may not have data or AI capacity? And for everyone who have their hands up, we're not going to be taking questions here. Put them in the chat and then I'll ask them. Thank you.
Alexis, you want to go or should I?
You go ahead. You go ahead.
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the things that we see a lot is that countries in the global south really struggle to report on this thing because it's really complicated, right? But when it is clearly explained, basically, when it's done well, a country kind of sets out exactly what it wants to do. Often they can kind of get a bit lost and kind of a lot of explanation that doesn't really say much. So we have found that kind of short and sweet really kind of gets their point across as to what they're trying to do for the Net Zero Tracker. But I think that there needs to be bigger or greater emphasis on moving resources from the global north to the global south to allow capacity building, because this is something that we need, right? We can't just ask the global south to build up their own capacity. So I think that's one of the things that could help, particularly in getting AI to be useful in this. Lexi, do you have anything you want to add?
Sorry, I was just having a cough attack. Yeah, I think the main thing is so there's a kind of reporting mechanism through nationally determined contributions that allows countries to detail, what they're doing and when, and that's sort of the state mechanism to do that. But when it comes to businesses in the global south, this is really where it comes to the equity consideration of, is it fair to hold the same level of scrutiny for businesses in the United States as in Namibia, for example? Those have very different national contexts, and it's not always fair to scrutinize them in the same way. So it's kind of something that we're trying to work on. Is we want really high integrity across net zero pledges, but we need to make sure that they're adaptable to national circumstances, which is a hard balance to make.
Thank you both. The second question is, should a country's net zero strategy be harmonized across all sectors of the economy, or is a sector-specific approach more effective?
Yeah, I can take that one. Largely the way that it works is that guidance is at the sector level, because different sectors have different capacity to decarbonize and different kind of need to decarbonize. So for example, if we think about cement being a very carbon intensive industry, but also very important, especially for countries that are still building up big infrastructure. Like, you need to build hospitals and schools and places to live and exist. That would be, you would have tried to decarbonize cement and use kind of less carbon intensive alternatives, but that you would have a higher impetus on those because that is much higher than, for example, or has different mandates than, for example, agriculture, which is very high methane, but also important for subsistence. So the IPCC has different pathways for different sector limits, and we expect decarbonization at different rates for those sectors. Camilla?
Yeah, I think I agree. I would just say that it is useful to have kind of cross-sectoral learning because often find ministers kind of thinking in silos just about, or ministers or people involved in that sector, whatever, are thinking specifically about their sector, and they could be learning from other sectors. And they could be kind of not just learning, but efficiencies, I guess, in decreasing emissions. So kind of thinking about the sector, but then also being open to cross-sector collaboration.
Awesome. Another question is, this is specifically for Camilla, and it's in addition to the publicly available reports, how does Climate Tracker ensure its process is transparent, impartial, and accurate? And how does it account for documents and content that may be present but not in English?
Great question. So I'll answer the second question first. So as I mentioned, we have volunteers from all over the world. And so we try as hard as possible to get people to look at the documents in their original language. So for instance, I do the French documents. I'll have a look at them. Not that I'm going to speak any French now because my French is shocking. But we always try to have someone looking at it. And this is something we've been struggling with the AI because we only have it in English. So we still rely a lot on our volunteers. And then to make sure that it's kind of objective and accurate as possible, we have 2 volunteers look at each draft to make sure that it's kind of as objective as possible. And we also have a button that people can write in to correct things if they need to. And sorry, it was objective. There are 3 great words.
Transparent, impartial, and accurate.
All right, yeah. So transparent, all of our data is publicly available, as is our code book as to how we look at everything. And we try to be as transparent as possible because we're demanding transparency from everyone. So yeah, that's what we do.
Awesome.
And
then
just if I can jump in, I saw a message in the chat about signing up to be a volunteer because, as Camilla mentioned, they are the lifeblood of the Net Zero Tracker. So I've just put it in the chat, and I will also put it in the follow-up email with the reminder for next session. I'll put a link for volunteering. But it's a really cool thing to see people from all around the world contributing to this open access project. So if you're thinking about it, please do shoot them a message.
Yeah, we would really, really love to have you.
Awesome. This question is more for Alexis. Don't you think that developed countries and large corporations, particularly in the fossil fuel industry, have exploited the carbon market and offset mechanisms to continue polluting without making genuine commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And could these strategies be deepening their negative environmental impact rather than driving meaningful climate action?
Oh, I love this question. Such a good question. There's a really good paper that I'm just trying to grab, but I will, if I can. Oh yeah, here we go. I will put in the chat just now. I'm obsessed with the net zero phase out, net zero commitments of fossil fuel companies, because for the most part, it is a masterclass in greenwash. There's a really good paper that I've just put in the chat, which is the kind of mismatch between the clean energy claims of 4 big fossil fuel companies and their actual capital expenditure on renewable energy. So a lot of times fossil fuel companies will say, we're the best placed because we are so familiar with the energy market. You need to keep us alive so that we can transition to renewable energy. And they have beautiful pictures of wind farms and people laughing next to a wind turbine or whatever. But actually their capital expenditure is largely less than 0.5% of their actual capacity to spend. So it's a joke. Less than 1% of their spending is going on renewable energy. And at the same time, they're using offsets, as you mentioned, to basically neutralize on the account books their emissions. And it's problematic for many reasons, not only the climate impacts, of there not actually being any emissions moving around, but also of the sort of reputation that they are holding as responsible actors on climate when they couldn't be anything further. And also it's important to note too that there's a growing movement to try to get the fossil fuel industry to pay for long-term carbon removal, and that they are best placed with their skill set to be able to do carbon removal. And within Oxford Net Zero, there's differing opinions on that, of whether or not we should trust the fossil fuel actors to lead on carbon removal, because it should be sort of polluter pays and they have the capacity to do it. But I also think that I don't want to be getting my energy from massive energy conglomerates. I want to be moving towards a world where we have very much community-led energy projects, much more decentralized hubs of energy rather than massive centers with massive profit centers. And I don't want to just switch to a green energy system that still profits a very small percentage of people at the very top, even if it's better for the environment, because there are so many more issues with the way that fossil fuel companies run our energy than just the fact that they're causing climate change. So yeah, and actually we'll be covering this in a session on the 19th of October about how to assess a credible net zero pledge from fossil fuel industry. And I will be doing that lecture. So I'm really excited to have more time to speak about the fossil fuel industry. So looking forward to that on the 19th.
And speaking of time, we are out of time for the Q&A. I'm really sorry. I know there are so many more questions. I have them at a list, but we won't have time. Remember that Alexis is on the Slack with us all. So if you want to engage more and pose your questions there, maybe she might answer, maybe someone else will. And for now, I'll let you know what our speakers for the next session is, who they are, before we move on to the breakout rooms. So next session, it'll be on September 12th. It'll be on non-state actor involvement in increasing ambition in NDCs. We'll have Carly Leong, the UN Asia Pacific Youth Advisory Group on Environmental and Climate Justice as our youth speaker. Yoba Sokona, the Special Advisor for Sustainable Development and the South Center and IPCC Vice Chair as our first speaker, and Kaya Axelon, a Research Fellow and Head of Policy and Partnerships at Oxford Net Zero as our third speaker. So that's on September 12th. And so sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but maybe you'll get to ask them in the breakout rooms.
Yeah, and thank you so much. We'll end the live stream there, and then I'll go through some of the logistics for our breakout session. So we will have breakout rooms again. And just a reminder on FAQs, the recordings, we've gotten a lot of emails about recording. Well, we've gotten a few emails, and they're always sent out in the reminder email after the session. And the languages take a bit more time because we have to overlay the tracks onto a different video. Just takes a bit of time, and so that's usually available within 48 hours. We mentioned a quiz we mentioned it originally doing one quiz a week, but now actually we're just going to do 2 quizzes overall, one covering the first 4 sessions